Bienvenidos. This is a podcast that explores Latinx media and culture in its many forms. I am Dr. Rojo Robles.
And I am Dr. Rebecca El Salois. And we are Latinx and Latin American Studies professors at Baruch College in New York City. In this podcast, we will analyze Latinx film, television, literature, art, and cultures.
We will consider how these works are perceived, analyze them, and investigate the real-world reflections and implication of that work on Latinx cultures in the U.S. and beyond.
Welcome to Latinx Visions.
Bienvenidas, bienvenides, bienvenidos.
Welcome back, everyone.
As an ending to our season dedicated to Puertorriqueñas, today we're dedicating our episode to the renowned spoken word poet, bomba player, and educator, Mayda del Valle. Mayda is the most recent poet laureate of Chicago, and in her work she introduces a sense of knowledge rooted in the street vernacular of Black Diasporican communities during the hip-hop era.
First, we'll talk a little bit about Del Valle's background, who she is, the art she creates, and what it means to her to bring these two things together in her poetry. Then we'll dig into the role of Puerto Ricans in the hip-hop and post-soul scene of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. This will help contextualize the work that Del Valle has created and the ways in which her generation has built new forms of expression that address the world in which they came up in.
And finally, we will explore and analyze a number of Del Valle's poems, considering the ways in which her poetry bridges culture, place, generation, and the role of music and food in understanding Diasporicanness. So let's get into her bio. Mayda del Valle is the second ever poet laureate of the city of Chicago. Del Valle is a poet, performer, educator, and interdisciplinary artist who was born and raised on the south side of Chicago. She is currently serving a 2-year term as poet laureate and is responsible for commissioning new works and creating public programming for children, students, and community members.
Del Valle was the 2001 Grand Slam champion at the Nuyorican Poets Cafe. She then went on to win the National Poetry Slam, becoming the first Latina poet to win. I think the youngest as well. She's also appeared on 6 episodes of Russell Simmons Presents Deaf Poetry. Mayda's work has been featured in a number of publications, including Latina Magazine, Urban Latino, and the New York Times. In 2009, she was invited to perform at the White House by then-President Barack Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama.
She earned her BA in Fine and Studio Arts from Williams College and then moved to New York to focus on her performance art. Her art is both multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary and often includes photography, video, music, and movement. She is also a dancer, a vocalist, and composer with Las Bompleneras, an all-women's bomba and plena ensemble based in Chicago.
Del Valle is the author of The University of Hip Hop, published in 2017, and A South Side Girl's Guide to Love and Sex from 2018. In 2024, she received the Letras Boricuas Fellowship from the Flamboyant Arts Fund and the Mellon Foundation. And in 2025, she was a dark matter artist in residence at Elastic Arts. Her most recent performance, Peace in Development, is a multimedia spoken word performance that explores the story of Puerto Rican migration to the south side of Chicago, titled Herencia.
She described herself in the following way. As the child of Puerto Rican migrants who grew up on the south side of Chicago, my work originates in the embodiment of what I consider to be a hybrid identity and experience. It is part Spanish and English, part hip-hop and salsa, part Nas and Sonia Sanchez, part Shakespeare and John Leguizamo. It is inherent history as well as tradition remixed and invented.
And she goes on to say, I create autobiographical narratives that utilize spoken word poetry and music intended for live performance. Rooted in the aesthetics of hip-hop and the urban Latino experience, my work explores themes of healing, transformation, and the recovery of ancestral memory in the modern-day diaspora. To understand what happened in Puerto Rican communities in the U.S. during the rise of hip-hop, we have to zoom out for a second and look at the broader historical moment.
Cultural critics like Nelson George and Mark Anthony Neal called the period from the mid-1970s through the 1990s the post-soul era. And that term matters because it names a generation that came of age after the major victories of the civil rights movement, but also after many of its promises began to fracture.
Mm-hmm.
This was a generation raised on soul music, that's why it's named post-soul, black radical thought and liberation dreams, but by the 80s and 90s they were living in a very different reality. Black public life was under pressure, radical organization has been dismantled, state surveillance and repression had taken aim at movements like the Black Panthers or the Young Lords, and the so-called war on drugs criminalized entire neighborhoods, especially Black, Puerto Rican, and other marginalized communities, while policing became increasingly militarized and prison expanded at an alarming rate.
And in the middle of all this, mass media, especially television, was shaping who got to be seen, who got heard,
and how Blackness, Puerto Ricanness, and Latinidad will be represented. That's the landscape where hip-hop emerges, not as entertainment first, but as testimony, resistance, style, and survival. Hip-hop became the language of communities dealing with displacement, underfunded, lack of access to education, police violence, economic abandonment. It gave voice to the rage, the wit, creativity, and contradiction of urban youth navigating a world that often treated them as disposable.
And one of the biggest misconceptions in popular memory is that this story belongs to only one community.
And yes, hip-hop is deeply rooted in African-American expressive tradition. That foundation is undeniable, but the culture was also shaped in constant dialogue with Caribbean communities, especially Puerto Ricans and Jamaicans in New York and beyond. That's where scholars like Raquel Zeta Rivera step in. Rivera has long argued that both mainstream media and academic history often erase Puerto Ricans' contributions to hip-hop, framing it as an exclusively African-American phenomenon. But that narrative misses the everyday collaboration, shared neighborhoods, and overlapping cultural practices that made hip-hop possible.
Yeah, Puerto Rican communities weren't outsiders looking in. They were co-creators.
Yeah, exactly. From DJing and breakdancing to graffiti and MC culture, Puerto Rican youth were integral to hip-hop formation, and they brought with them their own histories of migration, racialization, colonial displacement, and Caribbean musical tradition. What's important here is that this connection didn't begin in the Bronx in the 1970s. They go much deeper. They stretch back through centuries of shared African diasporic experience, through slavery, marronage, creolization, and anti-colonial struggle across the Americas and the Caribbean.
In other words, hip-hop wasn't born from a cultural vacuum. It emerged from long histories of Black and Caribbean exchange.
And for Puerto Rican communities in the U.S., especially New Yorkers and other Diasporicans, hip-hop became a space to negotiate identity in ways that challenge rigid racial categories. Because Puerto Ricans were often told contradictory things. They were too Black for some spaces, not Black enough for others, too urban, too Caribbean, too U.S. American, too something. Hip-hop gave them a vocabulary to refuse those limits. It became a site where Blackness, Latinidad, and Puerto Ricanness could be remixed, contested, and reimagined in real time.
So when we talk about post-soul culture and hip-hop poetics, we're talking about more than music or style. We're talking about a generation building new forms of expression out of political disillusionment, cultural hybridity, and historical memory.
And Puerto Rican communities were not just part of that history, they helped write it. What does hip-hop mean in Puerto Rican communities in the U.S.? We have to move beyond charts, genres, and headlines and look at las experiencias de la gente, at how young people actually inhabit that culture. That's where Mayda del Valle's work becomes a testimony. In her 2017 chapbook, The University of Hip Hop, Del Valle looks back at a formative summer program for her teenage years on Chicago's South Side. She gives us a framework for understanding hip-hop as a site of education, identity-making, and collective survival. And the title says it all. Calling it a university is a radical claim. Del Valle insists that hip-hop is a form of higher learning, not the kind sanctioned by institution, but a knowledge system created in neighborhoods too often dismissed as marginal. A curriculum built on the streets, in ciphers, in dance circles, on walls, in basements, and on park benches. This is a university without tuitions, admissions offices, or gatekeepers. Its pedagogy comes from lived experience. Its classrooms are urban spaces. Its faculty are elders, peers, DJs, b-boys, graffiti writers, spoken word artists, and ancestors.
I love that. I love that analogy. Absolutely.
What Del Valle makes clear is that hip-hop offered young Black and Puerto Rican communities a formation. It taught them how to move through the world, how to interpret structures of power, and how to create themselves within and against those structures. That is why her chapbook is organized around the 4 foundational elements of hip-hop: MCing, breakdancing, graffiti, and DJing. These are not hobbies in her telling, they are disciplines. Each becomes a mode of intellectual, aesthetic, and political engagement.
Hip-hop, then, is not reducible to just music. It's an entire ecosystem of thought and practice.
Exactly, and what makes Del Valle's framing especially compelling is that she roots this ecosystem in deeper Afro-diasporic traditions. For her, hip-hop is in conversation with ancestral memory, Yoruba cosmologies, and collective stories of survival. She frames hip-hop as part of a much longer continuum of Black expressive culture. Its improvisation, rhythm, communal energy, and spiritual resonance are all linked to inherent diasporic practices. In that sense, hip-hop is both a rebellion and an inheritance. It disrupts dominant system while carrying forward older modes of knowledge. That is why Del Valle's university is not about assimilation into established institutions. It is about affirming alternative epistemologies, forms of knowing built from migration, racialization, poverty, creativity, joy, and refusal. What she calls into view are what we might think of as lowercase community spaces overlooked by official narrative, yet constantly generating new cultural vocabularies. These are laboratories of invention. And in her poem, Chicago, 1993, Del Valle captured that inventiveness in motion. She remembers oversized clothes that now are back in fashion.
Yes, they are.
Yeah, graffiti, skateboards, smoking sessions, and music blasting in the background, artists like Nas and Biggie providing the soundtrack of an era. Instead, she frames them as part of a larger process of self-making.
Basically, like what adults might dismiss as teenage antics, these things were, in fact, practices of identity construction.
Yeah, that's precisely her argument. These young people were building codes of belonging outside institutional approval. They named themselves, they claimed space, and created aesthetic worlds that reflected their realities. Yeah, as Black Puerto Ricans, right? That is the deeper significance of hip-hop in her work. It gave youth permission to author themselves, even in conditions of scarcity, limited resources, underfunded schools, economic precarity, as we have said. There was a confidence that creativity belonged to them. And that conviction reshaped how they inhabit the city. Del Valle recalls the swagger of being 16 and believing you ran the streets, not because of ownership, but because presence itself transformed urban space. Hip-hop turned neglected environments into sites of possibility. Just as importantly, these practices were collective. Del Valle emphasizes the corillo, the crew, the chosen community learning together. They study films like Star Wars, Beat Street, dream of New York as hip-hop's mecca, and immerse themselves fully in the culture. But they were not passive consumers. They embody hip-hop. They live it as a discipline, as a language, and as a worldview. This is what the University of Hip Hop ultimately teaches us. For many young Black and Puerto Rican communities, hip hop was never simply a soundtrack. It was education, spirituality, rebellion, and belonging all at once. A whole world constructed from rhythm, movement, collaboration, and imagination.
I feel like this is a course you should teach here.
I'm ready for it. Hip hop poetics in New Yorican
let's
and
do
Black
it.
communities.
Let's make it happen.
Propose it.
So, when we were preparing for this episode, I listened to a number of performances of Del Valle's poetry, and one thing that came to mind as I was listening to her and reading the words was this idea of bridges, right? I see her poetry as something that bridges culture, place, and generations. And everything that you've been talking about so far really demonstrates the truth in that. The first two poems that really stood out to me were about bridging culture and place. And they were The City Song, which is a poem that she performed for the National Museum of Puerto Rican Arts and Culture in Chicago. I think it's maybe part of an upcoming project. And Soloem, which is currently, as of this recording, it's basically like we have Poetry in Motion here in New York. It's a part of the Chicago L Trains. They have a April is for the Poets ad campaign, and that's up now.
Yeah, because April is Poetry Month. Yeah, so they're like honoring her because she's a poet laureate.
Yeah. So let's talk about Soloem first. Soloem is about Papi, right? That's the character that we're learning about here, and how he always cheered for the White Sox. How he would always sit in the yard on a summer day and listen to Las Medias Blancas, which, as a New Englander and a Red Sox fan, I always heard, Las Medias Rojas, but Las Medias Blancas,
That's a new thing.
That's a different thing for me, no. But honestly, it's a very short poem, but it just seems like a very Chicago poem. However, it's not just Chicago, right? Because it also gives a little shout out to Puerto Rico at the same time. See, because when he was sitting there listening to these games, which I love, listening to baseball on the radio is phenomenal. I really enjoy it. Anyway, as he was doing this in the yard, he was surrounded by Mommy's Garden, which to the poet evokes a piece of Puerto Rico, right? So it's a poem that right now is traveling all around the city of Chicago, quite literally, but it's also a poem that connects Del Valle's Puerto Rican roots to her experiences of being born and raised in Chicago.
It's kind of like also like make me think also as graffiti, right? That travel at first started like people painting on the trains, right? So it's kind of like the art was moving throughout the city, and now like her poem that is very hip hop infused, it's also like traveling all over the city.
All over. So the other poem here that I wanted to mention was The City Song. And that's another great Chicago poem that takes the audience through the history of the city, from before the colonizers showed up. But it also connects it back to Puerto Rico. Like the way in which Del Valle seamlessly flows from the history and nature of Chicago, again, before the colonizers appeared, to the industry and development of the city really had me traveling through that history. So it's like a travel through time. She doesn't focus only on the good or the bad, but shares them all in a way that makes it clear that Chicago includes all of this, and this is the Chicago that she loves. There's one line in particular. She says, Chicago, stabled to the iron horses and locomotives that carry America's commerce on the freight lines that trickle out of you like veins across the country. I was like, ooh, wow. And the idea here is like Chicago is the heart of the country for her, anyway. I mean, some New Yorkers might push back, but there is something to be said about that central location of the city of Chicago that really makes this idea work.
It's important to mention here that Chicago was, just like New York, was one of the destinations of the big African-American migration from the South, right? So these cities were also like really essential for the development of these communities, right? In the same way that Chicago to this day is still a very important Puerto Rican enclave, right?
Yes.
The Puerto Rican diaspora has been like there since the 40s and 50s at least.
Yeah, and I mean, she talks about this in the history, about the history of the Underground Railroad there, the river, and the call to the Puerto Rican people. She goes on in this poem to talk about how the heart was untamable. So they tried to tame Chicago's river instead. And she tells us that the heartbeat is a song that calls Chicago's children north. Del Valle takes us on a winding journey down the river and eventually out to the Caribbean, and says that it was this song that called her people to the land. She then goes on to describe it as a land of spoiled milk and sorrow, and talks about coming to live the dream of being underpaid, overworked, and harassed. Dream obviously in quotation marks there.
Yeah, in an ironic
and
way.
very much.
Yeah, that was what most Puerto Ricans and Black people and people of color encounter in these cities.
Exactly.
They were looking to fulfill their economic dreams, and their
But
dreams
the
but the
opportunities.
opportunities were scarce, right?
Yeah, she also talks about being called to bring music with them when they came to Chicago, right? And how they did it, how they brought, as she puts it, all the music we could hold in our hands. And she goes on to name the instruments, and the audience is just like, yes, this, right? It's beautiful to hear. And she talks about how not just the music, not just the people, but how Puerto Ricans brought their own history, right? Their traumas and their joys to make a new song that makes the city what it is today. And if y'all haven't heard this poem, I definitely suggest looking it up. It's on YouTube. You can watch her perform it, and it's phenomenal.
Regarding Del Valle, it's very important to mention that a lot of her work, she's been a performer for many decades now, and a lot of her work is available on YouTube.
And then just to wrap that up, she ties the poem together with a declaration that it is the city of all that she loves. And that even if her heart is split between two places, obviously Puerto Rico being the other, Chicago has always given her the music to mend that split, right? It ties the pieces together.
Yeah. I wanted to also talk about another poem that has a similar vision, and that also introduces us to this idea of music and emotional landscape together. And that is one of her landmark or staple poems, Mami is Making Mambo, who she performs. You can find videos of her performing that in Deaf Poetry that we mentioned before. And also there's a TED Talk that she did that also she performs that particular poem, Mami is Making Mambo, Mamá está haciendo mambo. And in it, Del Valle transformed the domestic space of the kitchen into a cultural archive, performance stage, and a pedagogical site where Diasporicanness is lived, rehearsed, and transmitted. At the center of that poem is the mother, Mamá, not simply as a cocinera, but an artist and cultural worker. Her culinary labor becomes a metaphor for the creativity required of Puerto Rican life in diaspora, the ability to transform scarcity into abundance, displacement into belonging, and inherent memory into everyday practice. The poem opens with a repetition. That she kind of brings back a couple of times during the poem, which is Mami is Making Mambo. Immediately she's collapsing or putting together food and music into one another. Mambo, for those who don't recognize that word, is both a musical genre and a dance form that emerged in the mid-20th century out of Afro-Cuban traditions. And it blends elements of son, son, when I say son, is the musical genre
right.
Son, jazz and big band orchestration. And it has syncopated rhythms, bass-driven energy, and a lot of improvisation regarding dancers engaging with the musicians. And mambo in the 50s especially became a transnational phenomenon across the Caribbean, Latin America, and U.S. cities, definitely Chicago, but also New York. But beyond genre, mambo also signifies movement, it signifies sabor, it signifies sociality, and it's a music meant to animate bodies, because it's very frenetic, and it gathers people together, right? In cultural memory, it often represents joy, it represents sensuality, it represents the nightclubs of the 50s, it definitely represents Afro-diasporic creativity. So when Mayda del Valle invokes mambo in her poem, she's not referring only to the style of music, although it's part of it.
Sure.
But she's also invoking an entire atmosphere of rhythm, improvisation, cultural vitality, social dance, ones that links the kitchens and the dance floor, and more so diasporic Puerto Rican life.
And you can feel that when she's doing this poem, because she doesn't just say, Mommy's making mambo. She belts it out. She sings it. And
that phrase kind of she pronounce it and perform it in so many different ways throughout the poem. That although it's the same phrase, she keeps expanding its meaning in the way she's performing it. And likewise, cooking is not separate from this performance. It is choreography, it is percussion, it is improvisation, and the Mother's Kitchen has, and I'm quoting him, more of a get-down groove than a nightclub, and her culinary skills rivals legendary musicians like Tito Puente himself, El Rey del Timbal, who was the king of mambo, so he was also named the king of mambo. And this comparison is crucial. Del Valle elevates domestic labor, to the level of artistic mastery, insisting that the mother's work in the kitchen is itself a form of cultural production.
Of course, a form of hidden cultural production in many cases, right?
Unseen.
And she's bringing it to the forefront. She's making us see what is often unseen.
Yeah, and we can imagine, like, in the same way that Tito Puente will move his hands really, like, quickly all over the timbales and all the other percussion instruments he played, we can imagine her mother also, like, being
moving through the kitchen.
Moving through the kitchen and with the same sabor of Tito Puente's, right? That inventiveness is deeply tied to the Diasporicanness in this case. In the poem, the mother can turn humble or overlook ingredients like spam and corned beef in a can, and this is a direct quote, into something resemble virtual filet mignon, as she says. Yeah. So what she's demonstrating with this poem that this is not just resourcefulness, it's symbolizing the adaptive brilliance of diasporic Puerto Rican communities and other migrant communities as well in urban U.S. contexts where access, class constraints, and migration stories shape everyday life. The mother's ability to make do without sacrificing flavor mirrors the larger diasporic condition. Survival through improvisation, transformation, and refusal of blandness, literal and cultural.
Yes. Yeah. I apologize for my ancestors and their terrible food choices.
So food here becomes an emblem of linguistic and social practice. The poem's texture is saturated with Puerto Rican slang, Spanglish, and cultural references. That is also like very connected to the Nuyorican poetry movement. Yeah, the words that she also belongs to, right? So she has words like mija, cuchifrito, con sabor, papá, and they function like ingredients in a linguistic cuisine. The final dish will be the poem, right? And just as the mother layers adobo and sofrito and cilantro, del Valle layers vernacular speech to create a poetics of Puerto Rican being in diaspora. And her language moves like her mother's cooking, flavorful and untranslatable in its fullness.
Yeah. It makes it its own thing, right? It's the language uses that, you say one of the words or phrases that she puts is con sabor, but these words and phrases add the sabor to the
Precisely.
poem.
The poem itself has sabor because it has these words and phrases, that Puerto Ricans can recognize and
that don't always translate.
No,
like
they
that.
don't. They don't. Yeah, and that's why she also like defends the fact that they have to be in Spanish and they have to be set in the slang context of the word or phrase. So in this sense, cuisine becomes a metaphor for Puerto Rican slang and ways of being. Both are composed, mobile, and rooted in relation. Yeah, like recipes, diasporic speech is passed down, modified, and adapted to circumstance without losing its recognizable essence. It is never static. Yeah, it evolves in the city, absorbing influences while maintaining cultural specificity. Del Valle suggests that to speak, move, and cook con sabor is to inhabit a distinctly Puerto Rican diasporic ethos, or way of being, right? The kitchen is also where maternal nourishment becomes a language of love and support. The mother teaches not only recipes, but rhythm, dance, and confidence. Her TED Talk, for instance, is called Roots and Recipes of Love.
Right.
When she performed this poem, but also another one that are interlocked in terms of the same message. Right. Her care is embodied. It is tasted, heard, and felt. Nourishment is inseparable from affection. The repeated invitation, mamucha, come eat, the food is ready, carries emotional weight. Food is how love is made tangible.
I mean, it works for me.
Yeah. So this maternal pedagogy is especially important in diaspora where cultural continuity must often be actively preserved. In Chicago, far from Puerto Rico, the mother's kitchen becomes a site of cultural retention. Todas las cocinas son lugares de retención cultural. Through music, ingredients, and ritualized movement between sink and stove, she recreates a Puerto Rican world within the city. And the kitchen becomes a refuge where homeland can be sounded, smelled, and tasted into being. Del Valle frames this inheritance as bodily knowledge. And she says, I ingested rhythm through umbilical bones, she writes. When she does that, she's putting nourishment, ancestry, and identity into one line. Rhythm is not learned externally, but absorbed as inheritance. taste, movement, and music become encoded in the body, ingrained in my DNA, she says.
Yeah.
So the maternal line thus transmits more than recipes. It transmits a cultural sensorium, a way of inhabiting the world.
I'll say my ancestors didn't give me rhythm or good food.
So Mommy's Making Mambo is about like making good food, right? Comida sabrosa, but it's also like doing the work of cultural retention. And what she's arguing basically is that Puerto Rican culture in diaspora survives not only in grand political gestures or public institutions, but in intimate, everyday acts of making. The mother's inventiveness in the kitchens stands as a model of diasporic resilience. Her cuisine becomes a metaphor for Puerto Rican linguistic and cultural improvisation, and her nourishment becomes an enduring language of love that keeps culture alive in the city. The poem insists that identity is cooked, danced, spoken, and shared, and that in these acts, diaspora becomes home.
Yeah, and it is these sort of family and cross-cultural identities that I saw as yet another bridge in Del Valle's work, right? As she's constructing her poetry, she's building these bridges across cultures, across generations. And so there were two poems besides Mommy's Making Mambo, which obviously fits into this, but How to Write a Poem About Your Mother was another great one, and Grandmother, which Del Valle read at the White House back in 2009. So Grandmother stands out as a poem in which Del Valle makes these connections across generations, but also with the earth, with the land, right? La tierra. It is a poem about a grandmother that she never got the chance to meet. And there are lines in there about how she must reassemble herself from, and this is her lines, shards of Chicago ice and island breezes. And that contrast is stark. You know, Del Valle here is, of course, talking about the Caribbean and Puerto Rico, but Barack Obama, who's sitting in the audience that night listening to her share this poem, could likely relate it to his own experiences growing up in Hawaii, right? Where, of course, there are many Puerto Ricans as well, but that's a whole other episode. Yeah. We won't get into that today.
Yeah. She's talking about piraguas for those who know the word here.
So I love the focus on the common thread between her grandmother and herself being her mother, right? It's her mother and her mother's womb that connects her with her grandmother. She declares that their connection is full circle. She searches for secrets and patterns in her grandmother's experiences in what seems like a search for her own connections with her own heritage. She speaks about spirituality as something that both delivers and creates strength, and asks who her grandmother prayed to before she was told who her God should be. And wow, you know, calling out the colonizers there in a phenomenal way. She knows that her body is the instrument that, as she says, will rearrange the broken chords of her grandmother's history. Now, in the poem, How to Write a Poem to Your Mother, Del Valle speaks in the second person. And I have to say that I love the second person point of view. It is one of my favorite points of view in storytelling. And I think it's because there's something about using you that simultaneously distances the speaker from the narrative and invites the audience in to share in that experience with the speaker.
Precisely. Yeah. I can see that. Yeah.
So this is another bridge, right? One which connects the speaker of the poem with the audience. Maybe our experiences aren't identical, but that invitation to be part of them helps create and strengthen these cross-cultural connections. And when you add this to the generational discourse of the poem and the nostalgia she feels, you understand that on a personal level, because the poem is also about you, at least according to the speaker, right? According to the poet. This poem also addresses cultural bridges that connect the generations, such as deciding whether to write in one language, a second language, or, as you talked about earlier, some hybrid of the two. As she,
Spanglish.
Right? Spanglish. Oh, I love Spanglish. It connects this you with your mother and her own poetry and the nostalgia for the places that no longer exist as they did, as she puts it, when you were a girl, right? So it's inviting you in, it's making you a part of that story, and it's weaving these cultures and connections together, right? They're inseparable.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to wrap up this part of the episode with a little shift in focus, right? We're going to shift our focus for a moment to a poem by the Black lesbian poet Kate Rushin. It's called The Bridge Poem, and the Bridge Poem first appeared in This Bridge Called My Back, edited by Gloria Ansaldúa and Cherry Moraga in 1981.
This Bridge Called My Back, the anthology of, we're
the
Latina.
the
I'm saying like the, because it's like the major anthology.
It really is.
Yeah.
So when I first started thinking about Del Valle and this idea of the bridges, this did not come to mind as soon as I would have expected it to. But the more I thought about it, the more I saw a really interesting connection. Because Rushin's poem reads as though the speaker is forced to be the bridge for others, right? It starts off, I've had enough. I'm sick of seeing and touching both sides of things, sick of being the damn bridge for everybody. I mean, if that doesn't say,
Yeah.
that's fair. It's very fair to be sick of that. Rushin goes on to talk about the different responsibilities she holds as this bridge for others, doing things like translating, explaining, filling in gaps, mediating, reminding. That's a lot of labor.
Yeah.
And she tells us how sick of it all that she really is.
These are also like the invisible labor that many women undertake on a daily basis, and it's unrecognized, and most of us are ungrateful to that labor that happens.
Yeah, and it's that labor of being a woman, of being a mother, but also of being maybe an immigrant, of being having to do that literal translation for others.
When we say translation, sometimes it's literal in terms of linguistic translation, but also cultural
translation.
The children of immigrants experience that every day, that they have to be kind of like that bridge.
They have to be that bridge.
But also, that means also that they have to be dealing with the institutions who are demanding that translation.
Exactly. But, I will say this isn't how her poem ends. It does kind of end on a slightly more, I don't know if optimistic is the right word,
reframing,
but...
Maybe?
A reframing.
She reframes the idea of a bridge,
of what the bridge could be or should be for herself. So she writes, the bridge I must be is the bridge to my own power. I must translate my own fears, mediate my own weaknesses. I must be the bridge to nowhere but my true self, and then I will be useful.
Yes.
So she comes to recognize that the bridge she needs to be is for herself, and that seeing the bridge as something that will give her power will also allow her to be herself. So when I was listening to Del Valle's poetry, I heard that same message coming through. The bridges that Del Valle is building through her poetry are for herself. They're for her own identity, her own culture, and bridging that culture with family, with place. And I think that's really the beauty in these poems. We can connect with them as readers or as audience members, but honestly, she's not really writing them for us. She's writing them for that collective, for herself, but also for the collective community.
Yeah, these days I've seen a lot of the phrase, people, they are multitudes, right? That people have like so many...
we contain multitudes.
We contain multitudes. That's the phrase, that's a phrase that is being repeated on social media, but it's a very people are connected to that phrase a lot, especially within Black and diasporic circles, because it's precisely that idea of bridges that you're talking about. And in the case of Del Valle, it's also like we contain multitudes in the sense also of that we're connected to our ancestry, right? And that ancestral history and that more direct ancestry of our mothers and grandmothers, las abuelas y madres, right? That are with us, even if they're not literally with us, right? But they're like, we're embodying their lessons and their knowledge as well.
Yeah.
So it's been really great to talk about Del Valle's work today. Yeah, and with this, we're gonna like wrap up our session on Puertorriqueñas. Yeah, but I was thinking that also Del Valle's work allowed us to also like to think about very important topics that we're all addressing in the Black and Latino Studies department.
Yeah.
Right. And right now, this episode is gonna come out at a period when many of our students are enrolling in our classes. So we would like to finish kind of like reflecting on how works like Mayda del Valle's are part of our own work in the classroom.
Sure. Yeah.
So what about this particular work by Mayda? You see that it will like resonate or at least like be connected to the things you're gonna be teaching in contemporary Latin American fiction.
Yeah, so I'm teaching contemporary Latin American fiction in the fall, and we are going to be focusing on short stories from different places in Latin America, and we're going to be looking in particular at the ways in which the body and the house, the home, are tied to social, cultural, and political understandings of place and nation.
Yeah, these mommies making mambo.
Mommy's making mambo, yeah. I will have to pull that in. Because one of the anthology collections of short stories that we're doing is a Puerto Rican collection called The Youngest Doll. And we're going to be sort of looking at the way in which portrayals of gender, race, sexuality, and power both reflect and affect our understanding of the nation. So
many times this nation, as we saw with Del Valle, is very elastic, right? And it goes beyond borders, right? Because it's a construction of the mind.
And what we can understand as a nation, as a border, as a place, that can shift.
Precisely. And it shifts over time through generations. And
And so while most of the work, it's very contemporary, you know, I will be looking at some like we'll be starting with some like mid 20th century stuff to kind of get everybody into this understanding before we move to more contemporary times. But you're teaching a class called Afro-Latinidades.
So in many ways, like Mayda del Valle's work, we talk about ancestry, that talks about also like the connections between different Black diasporic group in the U.S., but also in Latin America. We're gonna be examining also like life stories, embodiments, how people are writing about their own life as Afro-Latinos, Afro-Latinas, Afro-Latina people, So we're gonna be examining different histories and her stories as well of African descendant population in Latin America, and definitely Brazil, for example, is going to be part of that, Colombia, but also in the Caribbean, Cuba, Puerto Rico, but also seeing how also the Afro-Latinidad is a complex identity rubric that allowed us to talk about Afro-descendants in the United States that are not necessarily, ethnically speaking, connected to the U.S. and actually connected to their respective nations and homelands and islands beyond the U.S. in the Caribbean and El Caribe, right, and South America, Central America, etc. And we're gonna be looking at also how I want to center their own voices. In the same way that Mayda del Valle is kind of like reframing her life story through her poetry, I want to also like not to have like people from outside talking about this population, but actually having the members of these communities talk about their own experiences. So we're gonna be looking at work from the early 19th century, right? But also like we're gonna move through the 20th century and 21st century. So most of it is gonna be memoirs, autobiographical writing, experimental writing, right? And also like some film and documentaries in which like these Black diasporic people are defining their life for themselves, right? As you said, also like they're like building a bridge to their own life and their ancestor and also and their nation. So I will be emphasizing this time because I have taught this class a number of times, and each time I try to change the perspective, but this time I want to like focus more on autobiographical text. And when I say text, again, it could be visual text.
Sure,
right?
Texts aren't just words on a page. There are lots of things.
Yeah, precisely. And but always like with the focus as the class demands, Black Latin Americans and Black Latina people. And we're going to see them as vital sources of identity, of spirituality, of resistance, and always as cultural expression, something that we saw with Mayda del Valle today.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as always in my classes, I always like to emphasize and bring context related to colonialism and its legacy, but also the legacies of resistance to colonialism, to slavery, to think about diaspora, thinking about, of course, racial representation and how it's linked or not to cultural representation, and always also like with a social justice frame. Yeah, that is essential for me.
Yeah, so if you enjoyed this episode and you were listening to our descriptions of the classes and they kind of piqued your interest a bit, definitely encourage you to sign up for our classes for next semester.
You have May, June, July, August to decide, but these are like good opportunities, and always like check out the offer that we have at the Black and Latino Studies Department.
Yeah.
Our podcast comes from this department, and it's always giving a shout out to all the professors and all the work that we do as a collective, so please check us out.
And for those who maybe missed our previous episode that came out, I had 3 students speaking with me about their experiences taking classes in Black and Latino studies. So if you're like on the fence, I recommend going back and checking out that episode so you can hear about all the great experiences those students have had as well.
Yeah, so my friends, amigos, amigas, thanks for joining us for this episode. If you have anything to add to the conversation, you can always reach out to us on social media or by email.
Follow the podcast on Instagram and Blue Sky at Latinx Visions. Our email address is latinxvisions@gmail.com. We'd love to include your thoughts in a future episode.
Subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Share us with your friends and family. Subscribe and leave a 5-star review to help others find the podcast.
Thanks again for listening. Have a great summer, and we'll be back soon.
Estamos a la escucha. Hasta el próximo season.
Dale. Until next time.